I think the goal today is to get the kitchen ready for cooking over the course of the next few months. Do you want a cup of tea? I think what we'll start doing is get a sourdough starter going so that we can make bread whenever we want. Sharpen our knives because they're probably dull from last year's classes. Maybe make sure that our cast iron is all cleaned and cured. And yeah, I think that's a good start. So, all right, we're gonna use my cookbook as our guide because there's a ton of information on the front end of the book that goes through all of the sort of ways to prepare your kitchen for cooking. Okay, so last fall we harvested apples from an old apple tree on the border of our property and crushed them and juiced them and put them in here and forgot about them. And so they were in the refrigerator all winter. And so this is essentially apple cider that has been forgotten and fermented. It should smell yeasty. It should smell like it's quote unquote going bad. I'm heating it up because yeast needs warmth to wake up and be called to action. So we're gonna heat this apple cider up so that the yeast dissolves faster. Bread is entirely a product of time and temperature, and you have control over both of those things. So the faster we heat this up, the faster the bread can come together. So you're gonna use about 1.5 teaspoons of yeast. So we're adding a commercial yeast to a natural yeast, which should ensure the rise of the bread. There we've got our apple cider, which to the touch is still warm, which is what you want. If it's too hot, it actually kills the yeast, which you don't want. Too hot is like anything that would burn your skin. I always tell people, like when you're using liquid in bread baking, you want it to feel like a hot tub or like a body of water, a bath, something you would want to get into. If it feels too hot to get into it, it's too hot and it could kill the yeast. So just use that as your guide. So next thing we're gonna do is measure out the flour. This recipe, which is a very basic bread recipe, calls for between 4 and 6 cups flour. I'll explain the disparity in a moment. And 2 cups of liquid. And that's a pretty simple, pretty easy dough to work with. The more hydration a dough has, the harder it is to work with. And the sourdough that we're gonna make after we make this bread is gonna be more difficult because it's gonna have a higher hydration level and it's just gonna be wetter. So you have to have a little bit more skill when you're working with it. But this one is really simple. This is a bread that we're gonna knead, whereas the sourdough is a bread that we just let ferment. And functionally, that sort of achieves the same thing and allows the bread to rise. But in the end, you end up with 2 really different products. We're gonna start with 2 cups of all-purpose flour, and then we're gonna add the apple cider and the yeast to the flour and bring it together to sort of like a mud. And once I feel like there's no lumps or very few lumps, then I'm gonna start bringing in more flour. And there's always a recipe for bread baking, but ultimately it's about what it feels like and what it looks like, also what it smells like. So we're just gonna sort of follow our instincts when it comes to bringing the bread together rather than carefully measuring out cups of flour, and you'll see what I mean once we get into it. We've got 2 cups of all-purpose flour and we've got 2 cups of fermented apple cider plus some commercial yeast to ensure that the bread rises. So we're gonna add the apple cider to the flour. Always add wet to dry ingredients. Make sure the yeast has a tendency to sort of sink to the bottom, so make sure you get that all out. Then stir as many times as is necessary to get most of the lumps out. You're gonna sort of knead the remainder of the lumps out. You see that nice sort of yellow orangey color? That's from the apple cider. And it'll give the loaf this like gorgeous golden color. So, all right, so now we've got a more or less consistent batter. There's some lumps, but that's okay. Next thing we're gonna do is add some salt while it's still nice and wet and warm so it can dissolve. So you wanna add a lot of salt. Think of sort of like a pinch of salt per serving, and this is a loaf of bread that's gonna feed like 8 people, so it's like 8 pinches of salt. So we bring the salt in like that, and now what we're gonna do is start bringing more flour into this dough, okay? So I like to put a sprinkle of wheat flour in, mostly because it just gives it a little bit more of a complex flavor, and yeah, it's just a nice touch. And you could try like a spelt flour, an amaranth flour, a little bit of cornmeal. if you want. But you never want to just substitute an alternative flour for a white flour, because you end up with a wildly different product that is generally dense and not what you're after. So mostly a minimum of 70% all-purpose flour and 30% alternative flour. So now we've got our wheat flour in there, and now what I'm gonna do is just start bringing the all-purpose flour in until it starts to look like a dough. And as soon as I can handle it, I'm gonna move it out of the bowl and onto the butcher block so that we can knead it and develop the gluten in the bread. All right, so. Now the dough can be handled, right? This is called a dough scraper. It's a super useful tool to get dough off of your tools, your other tools. So we've got that going there. And now what I'm gonna do is sprinkle some flour onto the butcher block. And the key here is you want a thin layer of flour in the middle. You want more flour around the outside, sort of in like a circle, because that you're gonna draw that into the dough as needed. So we'll do that, and then we'll turn this right out onto here. Okay? So now we can start the process of kneading, okay? Again, use your dough scraper to sort of lift it up off of there. Coat your hands in flour and start kneading like this. And I can already tell this dough is still pretty wet, which is not a bad thing. You definitely don't want too much flour in it because it'll dry out the bread. It's actually a really nice texture right now. It still has some lumps, so we're gonna have to work those lumps out of it. But when you bring flour into the dough, you do it through your hands, not just sort of chucking big patches of dough in, or flour into the dough. Sticking, that means it's just still a little bit wet. So we'll try to get that in there. Okay, so now we're going for something that feels very smooth and consistent. It's really soft right now because the gluten structure hasn't been developed. So the kneading is what allows the gluten to develop. All right, so now we're starting to see that the dough is tightening up a little bit, right? And this is, the kneading process is quite simple. You just essentially fold it over itself and then draw your hand through it, through the palm of your hand. Fold, push, turn. Fold, push, turn. All right, it's starting to feel really consistent throughout. It's still sticking to my palms a little bit, which means that it can take a little bit more flour. But you don't want to go too far. So once you've kneaded it to the point where they say it should feel like a baby's bottom or an earlobe, which are kind of different things. So I don't know, that sort of feels more like an earlobe to me. I'm gonna knead it a little bit more, tighten it up just a bit. And then we're gonna let it relax. And the way you do that is to just gently flour a bowl and drop it in, and then cover it with a moist tea towel or a cloth, because it will dry out on the outside and form sort of like a crust, which you really don't want. So that's why it's important that you dampen the tea towel. So the question people always ask is, can you do this in a KitchenAid? And you can, but the thing is, you don't have nearly the intimacy with the bread when it's in the KitchenAid. You can't feel how wet it is and what it needs. So I always tell people, always learn how to make bread by hand. And then if you want to do it in a KitchenAid and you know what it's supposed to look like, and go ahead. But I personally enjoyed this process, and you know, these days we got nothing but time, right? So just go for it. All right, so we're getting really close here. I'm gonna say we're good. So flip it over, shape it into a ball more or less, and then we'll flour a bowl and drop it right in and cover it up and let it sit for 1 hour, and then we'll check on it. Now, again, I mentioned earlier that bread is a function of time and temperature. So what I like to do is put this in a warming drawer because it accelerates the rising process. You can also leave it out on your countertop for 2 hours at room temperature. Just depends on how much time you have. We are now shooting how to make a starter. It is literally the easiest thing in the world. People are intimidated by it. They think they need to like find one that's been around for 30 years. A starter essentially regenerates itself every time you feed it. So whether or not it has a history, it will still functionally do what you need it to.
What were you doing?
So what I'm gonna do is draw my spoon through the starter so you can see the magic of natural yeast. So you see this? You see all those bubbles, those naturally occurring bubbles? That is all a product of time and temperature. So let me tell you how this came together. This is perfect for bread baking right now. It's full of gas, which means it's gonna allow the bread to rise. And it was made with literally 2 things, water and flour, that's it, in equal parts. So what you do is you start with warm water and an equal amount of flour. I like to split the flour into wheat and white flour, so 50% wheat, 50% white. So if you measure out 1 cup of wheat flour and 1 cup of white flour and 2 cups of warm water and give it a little stir and leave it in a bowl for about 2 or 3 days with a wet tea towel on top of it, it will start to come alive. And what it's doing is essentially capturing the yeast from the natural environment it's in. So if you have like a really old house with a lot of yeast in it, you're probably gonna get a starter faster than if you have a really sterile kitchen. So once you have combined equal parts flour and water and you let it sit for a few days, you start to see bubbles. Now, one way to sort of accelerate that process is to put something in the starter that already has yeast naturally occurring. So the best thing for that is like the skin of a fruit, a grape, a peach, an apricot, a nectarine, something that like all of those things have like a little fuzz on them or a little something that can capture the yeast in the air, and that accelerates the process. And the reason they call this a sourdough is because over time it starts to smell sour, which is a good thing. But it also means if it starts to smell really sour, it means it needs to be fed fresh food and sort of reconstituted. So after 3 days of your flour and your water sitting in the bowl and starting to develop bubbles like the one we have here, it's probably time to feed it. And what you feed it is exactly what it's made of, equal parts flour and equal parts water. I'll usually keep a bowl of 50% wheat, 50% white flour on my countertop and just reach a cup measurement into it, put it into the starter, get the faucet going warm, put a cup of that in, mix it until it looks like a consistent mud, cover it up, and wait a day. And so when you hear people talk about training a starter, it simply means that they're feeding it every single day at the same time. And you know that your starter is doing really well after a week's time when you're feeding it and it's literally doubling in size every single day and it's full of bubbles and it's captured a lot of yeast, and then you know that you're ready to bake with it. And there's a test you can do to be certain that you're ready to bake with it. It's called the float test. And basically what you do is you measure out your water for your dough recipe, which is warm, and then you add a required amount of starter, always saving some because you want to always keep your starter and feed it and keep it in your refrigerator so that you can use it to make bread in the future. And so after you add your starter to your warm water, if it floats, it's ready to go. If it sinks, it needs another day or 2 of feeding. So that's how you know if the starter is ready. And to be totally honest with you, there's been plenty of days where mine doesn't float and I'm super bummed because I really want to make bread. And what do? I cheat. I throw in a little bit of commercial yeast, which sort of like scientifically ensures the rise, but you still get the benefits of the starter. So the sour flavor, the thicker crust, the textured, creamier bread. So sometimes I'll use a bit of both. And my goal for you is to make a loaf of bread at home. And so it doesn't mean, you don't have to be a purist about it. And I think, bread is something that takes 100 tries to really feel like you have a handle on it. So, try different things, learn from your mistakes, and eventually you'll get a loaf of bread that you're really happy with. So, but this is the beginning. This is where it all starts, is with just equal parts water and flour left on the countertop to sort of capture yeast.
Dad, what are you drinking?
I'm drinking Ethiopian Sourdough
What the heck is that?
from Green Tree Coffee. Very strong, low acid.
All right, so what are we doing with you today?
Today, we're going to give an introductory course in sharpening knives. And we're going to do this in such a way that will get you started. There's a lot of nuance associated with sharpening knives. We're going to be using two things to sharpen. One is a Japanese water stone, and as you can see, it's in the water now. And we're going to be using a leather strop. This is a Japanese water stone. You can see it is made of two pieces here, and these are different grits. This is 6,000 and this is 1,000. The 1,000 is softer, but it has a larger grit in it, so it will take off more material than the 6,000 will. So you'd start here if you had a particularly dull knife, and you'd finish here on the 6,000. I should say that this is a pretty good combination. You can get stones that go up to 10,000, which is a very, very fine grit, and you can get these stones that go to 400, which is a very rough grit. Now there's all kinds of devices that you can use that will lock the stone in place. We're using a very simple device here. It's called a sponge. All it does is really just keep the stone from sliding around, so you have a solid work surface. And since this knife is, I'll say, medium sharp or medium dull, I'm going to use the 6,000 grit. So now, unlike the leather, where we're going away from the blade, in this case, away from the edge, I should say, in this case we're going towards the edge. And we put pressure on the area of the blade that we are sharpening. So you see where my fingers are, and keep these other fingers out of the way. You don't want to get them in the way of the blade. You can see I'm putting pressure. And I'm going to just give this about, let's say 15, 20 licks. I was surprised the first time I watched a Japanese, and now I'm going to move down, you see. I want where my fingers are in the center of the stone, all right? You're going to stay on the walk, not step off the walk. And that's the part of the blade that I'm trying to sharpen. And if you look closely here, you can start to see the buildup of some dark substance. And what that is the steel that's being taken off. And what I'll do is move my fingers up a little bit, you see? Now I'm sharpening a different part of the blade. Move again. Again. Now it's a little harder when you get to the tip, and some tips have more of a curve than others do. And here you're going to have to bring the blade up so you can get that angle. And you can see you start high and you end low. Okay, so we've been doing the one side, and now we're going to switch to the other. I'm going to put a little bit of water here just to wipe off the... There. What I'm doing is taking the steel filings out of the grit. You can see what I've taken off there. Some of that is stone and some of that is steel. Now I'm going to go to the other side, all right? Right? And here, we're going to do the same thing, and you simply switch hands. So the thickness of these 2/4 at the back end of the stone should be about the right angle for us to cut the edge. Okay. So that's much better than it was before. Now, some people will say, certainly, and I would agree, if you have a brand new knife that's already got an edge on it, then you don't really need a stone for quite some time. You can just use a strop. And what you do is put a small amount of some kind of compound. There's different sorts. The one I have in my hand right now is simple aluminum oxide. Again, you can buy this online. It's just a powder, a white powdery substance. You'd put a little bit of that on the surface, like that, and rub that in. This is what's called honing, and that's all I'm doing with this knife. You see, I'm trying to cover the entire blade with it. And I'm dragging it backwards, if you will, all right? So that'll just give you an idea. And I will use that technique to finish off and put a finer edge on a blade after I've used the stone.
So here we have a sourdough that is ready to shape and will soon be ready to bake. So take a look at this. You see those bubbles rising up here? It's a good sign. We made this dough last night. I brought it together. Like I mentioned earlier, it's a very wet dough. It's got a higher hydration level than the dough we made previously. So what I'm going to do here is scoop it out of. I made it in this because I didn't have a tall glass bowl at home. This was the biggest vessel that I had. So you can really make it in anything that's non-reactive. So what I'm going to do is scoop it out.
What's non-reactive mean?
Non-reactive means glass or wood. You don't want to use stainless steel. So now you'll see how wet it is? It's sticking already to my dough scraper. So what I'll do is I'll coat my dough scraper in flour, which will make it easier to sort of get out. Roll my sleeves up here. Okay, so I'm gonna tilt this on its side because it's heavy as heck and scrape the dough out. See how much different that is than the other dough? Much, much wetter. Okay, so now the next thing we're gonna do is continue to use this. We're gonna have to incorporate some flour into this. And we're gonna fold it over itself. You see that? You see how this is looks like it's alive almost, all of the bubbles? It's pretty much ready to go into the oven. So the next thing that I want to do, there we go. Now we got a nice boule shape, right? Yeah, I'd say this is ready because if we let it rest too long, it's just gonna sort of deflate. Okay, so the next thing that we're gonna do is put the bread into the pot. This has to happen very quickly because the first 15 minutes of baking is called the oven spring, and it's the only opportunity for the bread to rise. And the way for it to happen quickly is to have as much heat and containment of moisture as possible. So the minute I open the oven, you need to have everything ready. So we've got a knife to sort of cut holes or slice into the bread so that the gas can be released. We've got some flour, because we're gonna put a little bit of flour at the base of the pan, and we've got our bread here. So I'm gonna do it silently and quickly, and you just watch me, okay? goes directly into the oven. Now, it's gonna go in the oven for 15 minutes, and the reason that you wanna put it in a Dutch oven is because it contains the liquid. It's the perfect vessel for baking a single loaf of bread. The next thing that we have is our, you can see, we'll just check some progress here. This is our apple cider dough, which is coming along but hasn't risen enough. You can see it's still pretty solid. It hasn't risen enough to throw it in the oven yet, so this needs a little more time. Okay, so we pretty much use cast iron for everything here, with very few exceptions. It's heavy, but it is the best conductor of heat. If properly taken care of, it lasts a lifetime, and it makes wonderful food. Here we have 3 different cast iron pots. They're in pretty good shape because I regularly do this demonstration. But basically, if you're not comfortable using cast iron, as I once upon a time was not, this is how you have to think about it. If you take care of it every time you use it, which takes next to no time, it'll last forever. You can take it out of the oven. It looks absolutely perfect. Now, I put a little bit of flour underneath it, which should help prevent it from sticking. So I can already tell this is not sticking at all, which is great. So now we're gonna knock on the back side of it, and if it sounds hollow, that means that it's done. Sounds hollow, so we are all set. And really, if I don't say so myself, this loaf is pretty perfect. You'll see that it has, because it's a sourdough, it has a nice hard crust, and hopefully the texture of the inside is nice and creamy and sort of inconsistent. You want it to look more inconsistent in terms of like the holes and distribution of holes and things. The next thing is you need your bread to properly set up. You have to sort of resist the temptation to cut into it right away because it can collapse. The moisture in the bread has to redistribute, sort of like meat. So if you let it rest for 10 to 15 minutes, it will look like a gorgeous piece of bread when you cut into it. If you cut into it immediately, the texture, like the fabric of the bread, sort of collapses and it looks like uncooked even though it is fully cooked. So we're gonna give it 10-15 minutes and then we're gonna eat it.